Frigid night air slices across bare hands as a freight train surges forward, iron wheels screaming, lantern light bouncing off wet steel. A man runs across swaying cars at 20 miles per hour, climbs a ladder slick with frost, then drops between couplers as 30 tons slam together. In the 1890s alone, more than 8,000 railroad workers were killed, and tens of thousands were crushed, mangled, or thrown beneath moving trains. This was not bad luck or isolated tragedy. It was the cost of keeping America's railroads moving. Was this dangerous work accepted willingly, or was it a system built to sacrifice men? And if everyone knew the risk, who truly bears the blame? If stories like this move you, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which forgotten disasters or dangerous jobs you want explored next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. Let's begin. It starts with a shout and a moving train, a brakeman scrambling up a ladder in hard rain, boots slipping on iron as the lights fall behind him. In the 1880s, that first climb could be your last, because the work began before fear had time to settle. To make up lost minutes, crews coupled cars with the link and pin, stepping into the gap while buffers slammed. In 1888 alone, 518 railroad men were killed in coupling accidents. So what did a rookie learn first? The rulebook, or the reflex to yank his hands back in time? Managers argued the danger was the price of speed, and that seasoned men could feel a safe moment to move. Yet in 1893, the year Congress passed the Safety Appliance Act, about 1 in 320 railroad workers was killed, leaving the verdict open, naturally lethal work or a lethal system by choice. The danger intensifies the moment the train leaves the yard, because now the brakeman has to move while everything else is moving faster. By the early 1890s, freight trains routinely reached 20 to 25 miles per hour, and brakemen were expected to run alongside them, grab ladders, and climb without slowing the consist. Steel wheels shrieked against rails as cars rocked unevenly, their ladders slick with oil, rain, or coal dust. In 1892, railroad records showed more than 6,000 brakemen seriously injured nationwide. Many hurt during these running mounts, falls that ended with shattered ribs, crushed skulls, or bodies pulled under rolling cars. The companies insisted speed was essential to keep commerce flowing, and that stopping to board safely wasted valuable minutes. But how much skill could overcome a misjudged step when a man slipped at full stride with 30 tons of freight rolling inches away? Once aboard, the danger did not pause, it multiplied. Brakemen had to cross from car to car, timing their steps as couplers stretched and snapped with every change in grade. Between 1880 and 1900, falls between cars accounted for thousands of deaths, many listed simply as accidental, without witnesses or inquiry. The railroad explanation was consistency. Repeat the motion often enough, and the body learns the rhythm. Yet by 1895, 1 out of every 4 railroad injuries involved train crews falling from moving equipment, suggesting experience did not eliminate risk so much as normalize it. As the train pushed deeper into darkness, the brakeman's world narrowed to steel, motion, and timing. Was survival truly a matter of learning the rhythm? Or was speed itself quietly turning every shift into a test most men were never meant to pass? The climb does not end at the ladder. It begins again on the roof, where the brakeman steps onto a narrow plank as the train sways beneath him. By the late 1880s, setting handbrakes required walking car to car along roofs often 8 to 10 feet above the rails, with no guardrails, no harness, and no margin for error. Wind tore at coats as smoke and cinders burned eyes, and at night the world vanished beyond the lantern's weak glow. Railroad injury reports from 1891 recorded more than 2,000 falls from moving trains in a single year, many involving brakemen knocked down by sudden lurches or uneven car heights. Railroad officials claimed roof work was unavoidable, since manual brakes were the only way to control speed on long grades. But how much control did a man truly have when a sudden slack action could throw him sideways as cars banged together without warning? Weather turned the job lethal. In winter, ice-glazed roofs smooth, and in summer, heat-warped boards and loosened fittings. An 1897 Interstate Commerce Commission report noted that brakemen were twice as likely to be killed during winter months, a statistic blamed on conditions, not procedure. Men learned to crawl instead of walk, to hook arms through brake wheels, to feel vibrations through their boots. Yet even veterans fell, because balance failed long before courage did. By the turn of the century, thousands had died setting brakes from above, bodies discovered miles down the line, their absence noticed only when a task went unfinished. Was this a necessary risk of 19th century railroading, or proof that the system accepted death as part of its operating cost? The most feared order came when the train slowed but did not stop, because that meant coupling cars by hand. In the 1880s and 1890s, brakemen were expected to step into the narrow space between moving cars and guide the link and pin as buffers closed with crushing force. The equipment was crude and unforgiving. Link and pin couplers could shift inches without warning, and when cars met, they did so with enough energy to splinter wood and shear iron. In 1888, coupling accidents killed at least 518 railroad workers and injured more than 300, making it one of the single deadliest tasks in railroading. Railroad managers argued the danger came from carelessness, insisting skilled men knew how to read the motion of cars. But how much precision could exist when visibility was poor, signals were shouted, and timing depended on both men and machines reacting perfectly? Hands were usually the first to go. Medical journals from the early 1890s recorded thousands of finger amputations among brakemen, with some estimates suggesting nearly 1 in 4 suffered permanent hand injuries during their careers. Many returned to work within weeks, bandaged and altered, because pay stopped the moment a man stepped away. By 1893, railroad injury statistics showed that coupling accidents alone accounted for roughly 16% of all rail worker deaths, a number dismissed internally as unavoidable friction. Congress responded with the Safety Appliance Act mandating automatic couplers, but enforcement lagged for years. Railroads delayed installation, claiming cost and mechanical unreliability, while link and pin work continued into the early 1900s. Men kept stepping into the gap because the job required it, and refusal meant replacement. Was this a temporary hazard waiting on new technology, or a calculated risk where broken bodies were cheaper than safer equipment? Darkness changed everything, because rail yards at night erased distance, depth, and warning. Lanterns swung, engines backed silently, and brakemen moved through a maze where steel appeared out of blackness without notice. Switching yards were designed for speed, not visibility. By the early 1890s, some major yards handled thousands of car movements per day, and records show that yard accidents killed more railroad men than open-track incidents in several reporting years. Brakemen worked on foot, often alone, listening for shouted signals that vanished under steam and noise. In one Interstate Commerce Commission summary, nearly 30% of fatal railroad injuries occurred during switching and coupling operations inside yards. Railroad companies argued these deaths came from confusion and inattention, claiming experienced men learned to anticipate motion. But how could anticipation defeat engines that reversed suddenly, cars that rolled free, and schedules that rewarded haste over caution? Men were pinned between cars, knocked beneath wheels, or crushed against fixed structures like platforms and signal towers. Hospital tallies from large rail hubs show hundreds of amputations annually tied directly to yard work, injuries rarely fatal but permanently disabling. The work never paused for fatigue. Crews often laboured 12 to 16-hour shifts, and in those years, investigators linked exhaustion to a sharp rise in night accidents, though railroads framed this as individual weakness rather than systemic strain. A brakeman learned to trust shadows, vibrations, and instinct more than sight. Survival depended on guessing where steel would move next. When the shift ended, the yard kept working, and the next crew stepped into the same darkness. Was the night yard an unavoidable hazard of industrial progress, or a proving ground where human limits were knowingly tested until they failed? Winter stripped away the last illusion of control because cold attacked both the body and the machinery at once. Ice-locked ladders, numbed fingers, and turned every metal surface into a slick hazard that punished hesitation. Snow packed into brake wheels and froze solid, forcing brakemen to climb higher and work longer to set each car. Railroad accident summaries from the 1890s show fatal injury rates, rising sharply during winter months, with some regions reporting nearly double the deaths compared to summer operations. Railroad officials blamed weather as an unavoidable force of nature, arguing no amount of preparation could defeat ice and wind. but how much of that danger came from exposure itself, and how much from pushing schedules unchanged through storms that stripped men of grip and balance? Cold erased sensation. Men lost feeling in hands within minutes, making it impossible to judge pressure or timing. Medical reports from rail hospitals describe frostbitten fingers breaking off during coupling attempts, injuries recorded not as accidents, but as weather-related losses. Visibility collapsed during snowstorms. Lantern light reflected back into a man's eyes, masking gaps between cars and hiding moving equipment. In one multi-year review, winter conditions were cited in more than 40% of fatal falls from trains, a number that quietly contradicted claims of simple bad luck. Still the trains ran. Freight carried coal, grain and steel regardless of conditions, and brakemen were expected to adapt or disappear. Missing a shift meant losing pay, and losing pay meant losing the job. Men layered coats, wrapped rags around hands and leaned into the wind, knowing the margin for error had narrowed further. Survival now depended on endurance as much as skill. When spring arrived, the dead were already counted and replaced. Was winter truly an unavoidable enemy, or proof that the railroad system treated men as expendable parts whenever nature made the work harder? Stopping the train was often more dangerous than starting it, because the only brakes were human hands fighting momentum. On long grades, a brakeman was ordered onto the roof to crank heavy handbrakes one car at a time, while the train continued moving downhill. Each brake wheel could require dozens of full turns to bite, and missing even a few cars could mean runaway speed. In the 1880s, freight trains regularly stretched over 40 cars, and reports from the period show that failure to control speed contributed to thousands of derailments and collisions. Railroad engineers argued manual braking was proven and reliable when performed correctly. But how reliable was a system that depended on men sprinting across roofs as gravity steadily gained the advantage? The physical toll was relentless. Contemporary railroad manuals estimated that setting a single brake required up to 150 pounds of force, repeated again and again until arms shook and footing weakened. Injury ledgers from the 1890s list hundreds of deaths tied directly to falls during braking operations. Fatigue compounded the risk. Brakemen often worked shifts exceeding 14 hours, and by the turn of the century, accident investigators linked exhaustion to a measurable rise in braking-related incidents, though companies framed this as lack of discipline rather than workload. Air brakes existed, but adoption was slow. Railroads cited cost and mechanical uncertainty, even as internal figures showed that trains equipped with automatic air brakes experienced significantly fewer accidents per mile travelled. Men continued to race the grade, knowing that losing balance meant sliding beneath rolling cars. The work demanded speed, strength, and perfect timing, even as physics offered no mercy. By the time the train finally slowed, survival felt temporary rather than earned. Was manual braking an unfortunate limitation of early technology, or a choice to rely on human bodies where machines could have done the job safer? Derailments erased whatever sense of routine the job had left, because when steel left the rails, no skill could outrun the consequences. A brakeman might be on the roof, between cars, or running alongside when the track gave way beneath thousands of tons of moving freight. Track conditions were uneven and often poorly inspected. In the late 1890s, broken rails, rotted ties and misaligned switches caused a significant share of major wrecks, with Interstate Commerce Commission summaries listing more than 700 derailments in a single year across the national network. Railroads argued derailments were the result of material limits and geography, not negligence. But how much inspection was truly possible when maintenance budgets lagged behind expansion and trains ran heavier and faster each year? When cars jackknifed, brakemen had no refuge. Survivors described being thrown clear, while others were crushed, burned by spilled cargo, or buried beneath splintered cars. Fatality reports from major derailments show crew death rates far higher than those of passengers, often exceeding 50% in severe wrecks. Fire followed many crashes. Wooden cars, coal loads, and oil lamps turned derailments into infernos, trapping men under debris. In several late 19th century wrecks, recovery crews worked for days, counting bodies rather than rescuing survivors. Yet even after catastrophic accidents, service resumed quickly. Investigations focused on track failure or weather, rarely on whether men should have been exposed in the first place. Brakemen returned to work knowing derailments were unpredictable and final. Experience offered no warning, no advantage, and no escape once steel began to tumble? Was a derailment an unavoidable risk of early railroading, or the natural outcome of pushing heavier trains across infrastructure never designed to bear the load? Fire was the danger no one could outrun because once it started, the railroad became a furnace. In 1894, many freight cars were still lit by oil lamps, and a single derailment or collision could spill flame across timber cars, coal loads, and spilled cargo in seconds. Brakemen were often trapped closest to the source. While passengers might be thrown clear, crewmen were pinned under wreckage or tangled in gear as flames spread. Accident summaries from the 1890s show dozens of wrecks each year where fire followed impact, with crew survival rates far lower than those riding inside coaches. Railroads claimed these fires were freak outcomes, dependent on cargo and chance. But when cars built of dry wood carried fuel, oil, or chemicals, how accidental was ignition once steel began tearing itself apart? Rescue was slow and primitive. Volunteer fire brigades struggled to reach remote wreck sites, and by the time help arrived, heat had already done its work. In several documented cases, bodies were identified only by belt buckles or tools found nearby. Even without derailments, fires erupted inside yards. Hot boxes ignited grease, sparks from locomotives landed on dry freight, and brakemen were sent to fight flames with little more than sand and instinct. Railroad injury ledgers from the late 19th century list burns as a growing cause of death and disability, though they remained underreported. Management insisted these risks were inherent to steam power and commerce. Yet the same reports quietly showed that improved lighting, metal cars, and stricter handling rules reduced fire losses where adopted. Brakemen learned to smell smoke before seeing it and to choose escape paths instinctively. But fire offered no second chances once it took hold. When flames followed steel, survival depended less on skill than on position. Was fire an unavoidable companion of steam railroading, or another danger tolerated because it consumed equipment and men at the same acceptable price? Fatigue crept in quietly because exhaustion did not announce itself the way fire or falling steel did. It settled into muscles and judgment as trains ran longer and schedules tightened. In 1898, it was common for brakemen to work shifts lasting 12 to 16 hours, sometimes longer during busy seasons. Railroad records from that decade show accident rates climbing sharply after the 10th hour on duty, with injury likelihood increasing by more than 30% as fatigue set in. Companies argued long hours were a necessity of distance and demand, insisting seasoned men could manage their strength. But how sharp could reflexes remain after a full day balancing on moving cars, climbing ladders, and setting brakes without rest? Sleep came in fragments. Brakemen napped in depots, on benches, or not at all, then returned to moving equipment with dulled senses. A federal investigation in the early 1900s linked fatigue to hundreds of serious accidents each year, though responsibility was often assigned to individual lapses rather than scheduling policy. Errors multiplied quietly. Men misjudged distances, slipped on familiar steps, or failed to hear shouted warnings over steam and noise. Medical reports from rail hospitals show a rise in crush injuries and falls tied directly to exhaustion, injuries that looked sudden but were built hour by hour. Railroad management resisted limits, arguing that reduced hours would cripple efficiency. Yet on lines that experimented with shorter shifts, internal statistics revealed fewer injuries per mile travelled, a fact rarely advertised. Brakemen learned to push through dizziness and trembling hands because stopping meant replacement. The job rewarded endurance more than caution. As days blurred together, danger no longer felt exceptional, it felt routine. Was fatigue merely a personal weakness to be mastered? Or was it another invisible force quietly increasing the odds that one shift would be a man's last? Injury did not always end a brakeman's career, but it almost always changed it. Missing fingers, crushed feet, and damaged backs became marks of experience rather than reasons to leave the rails. By the 1890s, railroad surgeons were treating thousands of amputations each year, with hand injuries among the most common. Some estimates from that period suggest that nearly 1 out of every 3 brakemen suffered a permanent injury during his working life. Railroads framed these losses as proof of toughness, arguing that seasoned men learned to work around their limitations. But how much adaptation was possible when balance, grip, and speed were already stretched to the limit? Men returned to duty with splints, hooks, or stiffened joints, because wages stopped the moment they stepped away. Disability compensation was rare, and before formal workers' compensation laws took hold, injured brakemen often relied on charity or family to survive. Hospitals near major rail hubs became grim way stations. Records show repeat patients arriving with new injuries layered atop old ones, bodies wearing down faster than they could heal. Many accidents went unreported, logged simply as incidents to avoid liability. Management insisted injury was an unavoidable cost of industrial labour, not a failure of design. Yet lines that adopted automatic couplers and air brakes earlier recorded measurable drops in amputations, quietly undermining that claim. Still, the injured stayed. Leaving the railroad meant unemployment, and unemployment meant poverty. Experience did not make the job safer. It only made the risks familiar. By the time a brakeman's body finally failed him, the railroad had already moved on. Was this persistence a testament to resilience, or evidence of a system that depended on men sacrificing themselves piece by piece to keep trains moving? Death rarely arrived alone. It came in clusters that rippled through crews and towns alike. One wreck could erase an entire shift, leaving families waiting for men who would never step off the line. In 1900, railroad fatalities in the United States surpassed 4,000 in a single year, with brakemen among the most frequently killed. Newspapers listed names briefly, if at all, while internal reports reduced losses to numbers and delays measured in hours. Railroad officials described these deaths as unfortunate but necessary, pointing to the scale of the network and the volume of traffic. But how many lives could be written off before necessity began to look like indifference? Entire communities felt the impact. Rail towns depended on the pay, yet funerals became routine. Cemeteries near major yards expanded rapidly, their headstones marking men in their 20s and 30s, many killed within their first few years of service. Crew culture adapted. Men stopped asking where a co-worker had gone and started asking who would replace him. Railroad records from the early 20th century show turnover rates exceeding 100% annually in some brakeman positions, a churn driven as much by death as by injury. The companies responded by hiring more men, not by slowing trains. Training remained minimal, and the cycle repeated. Each loss was absorbed into the schedule, each absence filled by another desperate applicant. By this point, the danger was no secret. Everyone on the rails understood the odds, yet the work continued because the alternative was worse. When death became expected, it lost its power to shock. Was this acceptance a form of courage forged by necessity, or the final proof that the system relied on men being replaceable rather than protected? Money was the quiet force holding everything together, because risk meant nothing if a man could not afford to refuse it. Brakemen were paid by the day or the run, and a missed call meant no wages at all. In 1890, a typical brakeman earned between $1.50 and $2 per day, while railroads posted record profits moving coal, grain, and steel across the country. Injury compensation was rare, and death benefits were often non-existent, leaving families dependent on co-workers' collections or church aid. Railroad managers argued wages reflected skill level and market demand, insisting higher pay would attract reckless men chasing danger. But what bargaining power did a worker truly have when hundreds waited outside the yard gates for the same job? Contracts favoured the company. Men could be dismissed for refusing unsafe orders, and many were blacklisted across rail lines for speaking out. In the years before federal labour protections, courts often sided with railroads, ruling that workers accepted known risks when they took the job. The numbers reveal the imbalance. In the early 1900s, railroads spent millions annually on expansion and equipment, yet resisted modest safety investments that internal reports showed would reduce fatalities. Meanwhile, brakemen continued absorbing the consequences with their bodies. Some men pushed back. Brotherhoods formed, strikes flared, and demands for safer equipment grew louder. But organisers were fired, and momentum stalled whenever economic downturns flooded the labour pool with desperate replacements. Work continued because families needed food, and rent had to be paid. Danger became a financial calculation rather than a moral one. Each shift, a brakeman weighed the same choice: climb aboard or walk away hungry. Was this freedom of employment, or coercion disguised as opportunity in a system that profited from having no shortage of men to replace the dead? Change arrived slowly, not with urgency, but with resistance at every step. Railroads acknowledged the mounting death toll, yet framed safety reforms as threats to efficiency and profit. The 1893 Safety Appliance Act required automatic couplers and power brakes, but compliance was uneven and enforcement weak. Years later, government inspectors still found thousands of cars running with outdated equipment, even as accident reports showed coupling deaths declining sharply, where new technology was actually installed. Railroad executives argued the machines were unreliable, expensive, and untested at scale. But if automatic couplers reduced amputations by more than 80% on compliant lines, as early studies suggested, what truly justified the delay? Implementation varied widely. Some companies modernized quickly, while others delayed until fines or public pressure forced action. During this transition, Brakeman worked side by side with both systems, safer equipment on one car, deadly hardware on the next, making every task unpredictable. Even as technology improved, rules did not. Men were still expected to work long hours, climb roofs, and move between cars in darkness. Injury totals fell, but fatalities continued, often blamed on workers failing to adapt to new methods, rather than on incomplete reform. Railroads pointed to progress as proof they had acted responsibly. Yet many of the men killed in the early 20th century died performing tasks that safer practices had already made unnecessary elsewhere. By the time reform reached the entire network, tens of thousands had already paid the price. Advancement came not from foresight, but from accumulated loss. When safety finally became standard, it was treated as innovation rather than obligation. Was this progress delayed by technical limits, or by a calculation that measured lives against cost and waited until the numbers forced change? By the time reform spread, the mindset of the job was already set, because danger had become part of a brakeman's identity. Survival was worn like a credential, proof that a man belonged on the rails. Veterans measured experience in scars and missing fingers. In the early 1900s, railroad hospitals reported that a significant portion of returning patients were repeat cases, men injured once, twice, sometimes 3 times, before disappearing from the rolls entirely. Railroad culture reinforced this acceptance. New hires were warned, not protected, told which moves killed men and which sometimes worked. But if death was framed as a failure of judgment, how could the system itself ever be questioned? Stories circulated of men crushed between cars or lost in storms, retold as cautionary tales rather than indictments. Newspapers praised bravery and endurance, rarely asking why such courage was required for routine work in the first place. The companies leaned into this narrative. By emphasizing toughness and personal responsibility, they shifted attention away from equipment, schedules, and policy. Accident reports continued to cite employee error as the primary cause, even when conditions were unchanged from previous fatalities. Numbers reveal the cost of this thinking. In the first decade of the 20th century, thousands of brakemen were still injured annually, despite improved technology, because expectations remained rooted in an older, deadlier era. Men internalized the risk because resistance meant isolation. Questioning orders labeled a worker unreliable, and unreliable men did not stay employed long. Danger became normal. Fear was managed, joked about, or buried under routine. The railroad did not need to force compliance when culture did the work for it. As one generation replaced another, the same lessons were passed down: survive if you can, and accept the rest. Was this culture a shield that helped men endure impossible work, or the final mechanism that allowed a lethal system to continue long after its worst dangers were known?